And we have some more breaking news. I'm going to bring in Jessica Schneider at the courthouse. The judge has made a ruling in the case of the United States of America versus Paul Manafort. Jessica?
That's exactly right, Jake. The judge declaring a mistrial as to 10 of the counts. These are 10 counts that the jury could not come to a unanimous consensus on. You know, this is all happening very quickly here. The last word we got is that the judge was going to be talking to these jurors individually, but we understand the jurors are in fact inside the courtroom. The judge has been talking to them, but in the meantime, the judge has now decided a mistrial will be declared as to those 10 counts where the jury could not reach a consensus. So this, in a sense, is a victory for the defense team here. They were hoping for this hung jury, and now they have it with at least 10 of these counts. Now, of course, we have those other 8 counts. There were 18 counts total. So for those other 8 counts, Judge Ellis has indicated here he will be reading the verdict for
Jessica,
those 8 counts.
If I can interrupt for just 1 second, I'm being told that Manafort has been found guilty of at least one of the counts. I suppose he's reading them out in the courthouse right now. So if he's guilty of one of the counts, I don't know what that means as for the other 7. Let me bring in Evan Perez. What's going on?
That's right, Jake. Right now, the judge is going through the verdict from the jury, and basically what we know right now is that Paul Manafort has been found guilty of at least one count. Now, we don't know exactly what the details are that's happening right now in the courthouse behind me. Right now, you can actually hear some people a crowd here out in the square in front of the courthouse reacting with cheers. So they're hearing the news as well that Paul Manafort has now been found guilty of at least one of these 18 charges that he was facing. Now, we are still waiting for the details of which count this is, but what we heard, as Jessica pointed out just a few minutes ago, was that the jury had agreed a unanimous verdict on 8 counts, and they were deadlocked on 10. So right now we're waiting to hear the details of which charges he was found guilty on and which ones they were deadlocked on, Jake.
And what's going on right now for viewers at home is the judge is reading each one of the verdicts, and that's not just a matter of bang, 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 bang. You have to go through what all the charges are and then say what the jury has concluded. So one of the 18 counts, Paul Manafort has been found guilty. Now I'm being told right now that the jury has found Paul Manafort guilty of 8 of the 18 counts. The other 10, there has been a mistrial declared. Let me go to Jessica Schneider with this breaking news. Paul Manafort found guilty of 8 counts.
Guilty on 8 of those counts, 10 of those counts sort of wiped away for now, for lack of a better term, because the judge has declared a mistrial. The jury couldn't come to a consensus on those 10 counts. And, you know, I want to explain for viewers here a little bit of the reason for the delay. There are no cameras, there are no phones allowed inside the court at all. So what we're relying on are people who are running from the courtroom down to our people who have computers, and they're able to talk to us via landline and computer. So that's the reason why we're not in there with our cell phones. So yes, the judge has announced that this jury found Paul Manafort guilty on 8 counts, and there has been a mistrial declared in 10. So we're still waiting to get a bit more information here as it comes out. We did hear some cheers outside the courthouse, as Evan mentioned. You know, so not good for the defense on those 8 counts, but, you know, a little bit of a win for them as to the 10 counts that have been declared as a mistrial here. But again, considerable jail time Paul Manafort is facing. Remember, if he had been convicted on all 18 counts, he faced 305 years in prison. A lot of these counts are up to 30 years in prison. So this is by no means a win for Paul Manafort. He has been found guilty on 8 of these counts. Jake?
All right, so just to take a step back, we started the show in Manhattan. President Trump's former fixer and longtime personal attorney Michael Cohen is pleading guilty to a number of charges, including campaign finance violations, tax fraud, bank fraud. Meanwhile, 250 miles south, President Trump's former campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, has just been found guilty of 8 charges. Laura Coates, let me go to you. I guess the government will have to decide whether or not it wants to have another trial to bring these other 10 charges. But these 8 charges, that's very significant, and it does call into question why Paul Manafort did not agree to a plea deal.
Well, he's 68 years old, Jake, and you're talking about 30 years for each of the charges, 240 years he's facing right now in prison if he actually does not have a successful appeal to overturn the convictions. He probably did not try to do a plea offer because he thought maybe there was a chance of pardon, and that's still out there. But 240 years, you're not talking about one life sentence for this 68-year-old man. You're talking about countless life sentences. This is a huge burden, and the government will not get greedy, I predict, to try to get him the remaining 300 years for each of those 10 charges.
And let me bring in Preet Bharara. And then, Preet, if you had been prosecuting this case, and let me just take a moment to break down the charges. 8 charges. Manafort was found guilty of 5 tax fraud charges, 1 charge of hiding foreign bank accounts, and 2 counts of bank fraud. These are all felony charges. They're very serious charges. 5 tax fraud charges, 1 charge of hiding foreign bank accounts, and 2 counts of bank fraud. Preet Bharara, if you were the prosecutor, would you just take the W and walk away, or would you try to also prosecute and the charges that were found hung, the 10 other charges?
Yeah, you might. This is so unusual, as I said a couple of times, insofar as there is another case pending against him in the District of Columbia. And I think what I would probably do is tell my folks, let's see why the case turned out the way it turned out in this case, see what the appropriate sentence would be on the charges of which he was convicted, and see how much difference it would make, if any, if we convicted on the remaining 10 charges, and also see what happens in Washington. And at the end of the day, maybe it's a wash, and you wouldn't get, more accountability by convicting someone of additional counts, depending on, how the guidelines work out and what accountability is brought to bear in the District of Columbia case.
How soon do they have? How long do they have to make up their mind about whether or not they want to retry the 10 charges on which he was the jury was unable to come to a verdict?
There's no absolute set time. Usually the court wants to know. In cases where we had mistrials frequently, I would announce immediately if there were no convictions at all, that we were prepared to go forward, so people knew that we were serious about holding the person accountable. But they probably will decide in a relatively short period of time. And
how, in terms of sentencing, you heard Laura Coates say there that Paul Manafort, if he is given the harshest possible sentence for all of these 8 charges, could be facing life in prison. I mean, it's 240 years in prison, and he's 68 years old. Even he was.
People like to cite.
How long? Yeah, how long do you actually anticipate? I mean, what's the average sentence for charges like this?
I mean, again, it depends on. I don't know which particular charges he was convicted of, and what the dollar amounts were, and what the other extenuating circumstances are. But a white collar case like this, you're probably talking about a few years. And when people cite those huge amounts, like life in prison or 300 years, they're going on what the statutory maximum is for every count. And the way the guidelines work often is, additional counts that you might be convicted of don't necessarily add any jail time, and they become sort of redundant. And
of course, then there's also the question about whether or not President Trump pardons him. Now, there has been some discussion of some charges are state charges, some charges are not state charges in some of these cases. All of these are federal charges, so President Trump theoretically would be able to pardon him for all of them?
That's correct.
Okay, and Paul Manafort has acted as if he is a man that is not worried about this case. So one might wonder if he is counting on such a thing.
He may be. He was pretty brazen when he was on house arrest. And remember, in the other case in D.C. that I keep referring to, he's not only charged with the original counts that the prosecutors brought against him, but also witness tampering, and that's what landed him off of bail and back in prison to begin with.
Let me bring in Evan Perez right now for a little bit more detail on the charges. Evan?
That's right, Jake. Well, we have now the details of exactly which charges. We're talking about the count 1 through 5, which were the tax fraud charges. He was found guilty on all those 5 charges, and those all carry 3-year terms that would be served concurrently. The count 12, which is the failure to declare a bank account for the year 2012, that carries a 5-year term, and then there's 2 charges of bank fraud, which are 30-year terms for both of those charges, Jake. So Paul Manafort is looking at the rest of his life in prison, when this is all over with, if this is allowed to stand.
All right, Evan Perez, thanks so much. I want to get reaction from my panel here. Sorry, guys, there's been quite a lot of breaking news. We haven't even taken any commercial breaks. Paul Manafort guilty of 8 charges. Jen Psaki?
Well, first of all, if you're President Trump and you have your campaign manager going to jail for a long time, you also have your personal lawyer going to jail for a long time, you're pretty freaked out. Ultimately, this is also a political question, not just a legal question for all of these people. At what point will Republicans in Congress stand up and say, this is not acceptable, this is not okay, there is something very bad going on here? We haven't seen a lot of courage on that front, but a lot more is happening that people are going to point to as and asking their members to stand up, I think.
Now, to be fair, these are charges, at least as far as we know, because we don't know what Michael Cohen's plea is, for things that happened before Donald Trump was president. Josh, I'm sure that's something a Republican would say.
I feel kind of like a one-trick pony on this, but I think we just continue to, it's so easy to conflate 2 issues. The Russia investigation that's ongoing with Mueller, and then what just happened with Paul Manafort. I mean, what happened with Paul Manafort looks like 5 convictions of tax evasion that happened over the previous decade and a half before you even met Donald Trump, right? So,
But Josh, look, Paul Manafort also was the guy who was overseeing the changing of the convention platform that made it friendlier to Russia. You have Michael Cohen, who was leading the Russia business dealings. There is more here than just this has nothing to do with Trump.
Again,
we'll learn more. But
we will learn more, and if it ever gets into that, then I will concede the point. But it hasn't gotten into that. And I think what you're introducing there is a bunch of facts that have absolutely nothing to do with the fact pattern that ultimately convicted Paul Manafort today.
Well,
and
let's
that,
just
in and
start.
of itself,
Well,
is
I think
important.
we have to remember we're at the beginning. This is not the end. What this case proved, what he was found guilty of, is broadly hiding money. When this goes to the D.C. court, they're going to look at whether he was acting as a foreign agent and also money laundering charges. You don't know where this is going to go, who it's going to touch, and I just think we should remind people when Watergate happened, ultimately 40 government officials were indicted or jailed.
including a
The
dozen
pleas
from the White House.
and
Including a dozen from the White House.
indictments are stacking up quickly. You have no idea how far this is going to go.
And I take your point, but I just want to point out that the money that Paul Manafort is accused of laundering or hiding, a lot of it is from people in Ukraine who have strong alliances with Vladimir Putin. That's just a factual that it happened before Trump, et cetera. But there is the cloud of Russia over this.
I think we should be looking at these cases. Were Michael Cohen and Paul Manafort, although these are separate cases, are the prosecutors showing they were corruptible? And that's the big thing to keep in mind as we move forward.